Nutrition for food service and culinary professionals. Today we're on Chapter 9, which is Recipe Makeovers. As a culinary professional, you have a responsibility to your clientele to have an understanding of contemporary eating styles that are balanced, limited in rich ingredients, and are nutritious. There's a lot of accountability with cooking for your clients. After all, it's one of the few professions where people actually ingest what you're selling. For culinary professionals, that's an honorable responsibility with tremendous and ethical implications. This chapter will help you when you're working on your Project B, which is the Lean Global Cuisine Project. You can read through the requirements of the project in your syllabus where the rubric is listed. You'll want to choose a recipe and decide how to make it more balanced. Use tips from this chapter to assist you in making your recipe more nutritious and delicious. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about general ways to modify recipes that improve the overall nutritional value of that recipe, and also considerations that you have to keep in mind when you're trying to improve those recipes. We're going to be looking at different recipes from different categories and talk about recommendations and how to modify it to meet a nutritional goal. So we'll be covering all the different parts of the meal: appetizers, entrees, how sauces and dressings fit into the mix, and also desserts. And then today we'll end with information on gluten-free baking. Keep in mind when you're thinking health, wellness, and balance in a recipe, you don't cook two different ways, healthy or unhealthy. The cooking is the same, but the ingredients in richer, unrestricted cooking contain more sodium, saturated fat, sugar, and less overall balance. It's a lot easier to add butter, cream, salt, or sugar to enhance a dish if it lacks flavor. But it requires more skill to understand what is missing to bring out the food's natural flavors. Understanding the dietary guidelines for Americans, applying what you know about nutrition, selecting appropriate cooking methods, and adding a generous portion of your own creativity will result in recipes that delight and also meet nutritional needs of your customers. So always keep this in mind. It doesn't have to be good or bad, healthy, unhealthy. It's important to think about making just simple changes that you can adapt always. And in the long run, think about the health of the country, the community that you live in. There are some different reasons to modify, recipes for nutritional and health purposes. You may want to reduce the calories, the fat, the saturated fat, the sodium. You have to really base it on what your intended audience or intended result is. So, for instance, if you are dealing with, or your concerns are dealing with cardiovascular, let's say you want your menu to be a little bit more heart healthy, then there's certain things that you want to think about. Potentially the saturated fat content, or maybe just overall, being conscious of not exceeding calories for weight management. Or maybe you're dealing with clients that have high blood pressure and that you have to really look at reducing the sodium. Another concern might be people with allergens. So there's a lot of different reasons that you would choose to modify. You also may want to increase a nutrient. And that's always something that I like to promote, is nutrition by addition. And that means, what can I add to a recipe to make it more health conscious, as opposed to what I have to give up or what do I have to take away? So you may want to increase a nutrient such as fiber or calcium. So if your goal is to increase the calcium content of a meal, instead of using mayonnaise for a salad, like a balanced salad, you might use yogurt. Or you might want to use whole grain breads and buns and rolls as opposed to enriched white flour if you're trying to increase the fiber content. So the takeaway in this message is really nutrition by addition. And if you think about it in those positive terms, it's really much more acceptable to clients, customers. It's also a little bit more positive for you to work with. So when we look at meal preparation in general, we're saying here bad habits, but the reality is we do a lot of things to add flavor when it's not really necessary. Like when you're doing a steak or a veal and you're adding some sort of cream sauce, we tend to use a little bit more of the cream and the butter. And in reality, you're generally just upping the calories and saturated fat content, and really you can be, using other things to enhance the flavor. Let's say a soup that you make doesn't have a lot of flavor. The tendency is to always add more salt or more bacon or more fat, but it might be better to even think about adding a little bit of vinegar or some fresh herbs or some of your more savory herbs like cumin and coriander, onion powder, and that way it's going to really pick up the flavor without, needing the salt. So there's just some habits that we get into when we're cooking, and when you begin to just stop and think about some of the things you're doing, you might be able to have a better outcome in terms of and where nutrition plays a role. There's 4 ways to modify a recipe when you think about it. You can change a technique of preparation. You can add a healthy technique of preparation. You can change or add healthy cooking methods. You can change an ingredient by either using less of it or maybe eliminating it altogether or replacing it with something else that's a little bit healthier. You can add new ingredients to build flavor, such as dry rubs or toasted spices or fresh herbs. So when you look at a recipe, you want to review it, you want to decide what you can change, what must stay because of what it does to the end result. So for instance, if you're doing a pound cake or a dessert bread, maybe you can try to reduce the amount of sugar, which is not really going to change the outcome of the product. Maybe you're going to add some mashed bananas or prune puree in place of some of the fat, which gives you the sensation of fat. It holds in the moisture and it also sweetens the product. If you're trying to build flavor, you can, like if you're making even just plain old brown rice, you can toast the grains of rice in just a little bit of oil, or even plain without oil. And then instead of adding water, you can add, like fat-free chicken stock or veggie broth or something to really pop the flavor, as opposed to, just using white rice and just using water. So there's a lot of different ways to modify. So you have to think about what your end goal is. Is your goal to reduce calories? Is your end result, are you needing to reduce sodium? And you figure that out by doing nutrient analysis on that recipe. And there's many different ways of doing that. You can find websites such as myfitnesspal.com. You can use nutritiondata.com. And you probably even have some of your own favorites. I think some people use Spark People. There's a lot of different ones out there where you can input all the recipe ingredients and it'll determine what the calorie and nutrient profile is. And just by looking at that, that might give you an idea of just, what you need to modify. If it's in the case of adding an ingredient or adding a cooking method to build flavor, that certainly is always a possibility without necessarily looking at the calories in general, just, adding flavor. So can there's a lot of different substitutions. And if you refer to page 264 and 265 of your textbook, you'll see several recipe substitutions. So, for instance, in baking, you can substitute half of the butter with applesauce. And that's going to give you the same effect that butter's going to give you without the calories. When you're substituting butter for applesauce, you're substituting carbohydrate for fat. Fat is 9 calories a gram, whereas applesauce, which is a carbohydrate, is only 4 calories a gram. So you can imagine how many calories you're reducing just by substituting, the carb for the fat. When cooking, sautéing, roasting, a wonderful piece of steak, you can add the butter at the end of the preparation. Let's say you're sautéing a piece of fish on, in a skillet or on the grill. Maybe add a little bit of butter to melt over top just to give you the flavor, as opposed to cooking the fish in the butter. That way you're reducing your saturated fat content, because you can be cooking with the oil and just adding butter for flavor. By adding butter at the end, it's not really changing the calorie content at all. Your oil and butter are going to be the same calories per tablespoon, but you're reducing your saturated fat content, which is really a goal for everyone, because saturated fat tends to increase our risk for heart disease. So if you're wanting to reduce some of the cholesterol or just overall reduce your egg yolks, you can use 2 egg whites in place of one whole egg. And that would be a way of reducing calories and also cholesterol, if that's a concern. If your goal is to reduce fat, saturated fat, and maybe increase calcium, you can use light or non-fat mayonnaise or even non-fat plain Greek yogurt. So that's going to really enhance, it's going to give you the same product result, maybe with a little tang, but you're not getting the same amount of fat, plus you're adding calcium from the yogurt and also vitamin D. So instead of a cup of chopped nuts, use toasted chopped nuts, use less of them. So if a recipe calls for a cup and you reduce it to a half, you're saving yourself probably 400 calories just in that ingredient alone. So there's a lot of ways of reducing and providing substitutions. Can you think of any more? So how do I do it? Like, how do I modify a recipe? You want to consider these fine points. One is the nutritional analysis. You want to look at flavor profile. You want to look at what the functions of those ingredients are. I can't take away a major ingredient that has a function in that product that may ruin it if I take it out. You have to look at the different cooking techniques and how acceptable will that modified recipe be. Because as we always say, taste is foremost. So no matter how healthy it is and no matter how much you've modified it, if it doesn't taste good, it's not really worth doing. So let's look at nutritional analysis. You examine the product and decide what you want to accomplish and how you'll achieve changing its nutritional profile. For example, in a meatloaf recipe, you may decide to decrease the fat content and increase the fiber content. You may decide that the calorie content is too high or that the recipe is too high in sodium. You can accomplish this task by using a recipe analyzer like nutritiondata.com or myfitnesspal.com, or if you're in an institutional setting, there's a very expensive, wonderful product out there called Genesis. And that would give you the information you need to be able to say what needs to be changed in this recipe, what can be changed. Then you want to look at the flavor profile. Flavor has to be the driving force when substituting ingredients. There are some recipes that just can't be modified to your level of satisfaction. When evaluating, you have to consider what you can add to the recipe to ensure maximum flavor. Should you try to mimic a taste of the original version, or maybe you'll have to introduce new flavors? A fresh herb, a spice, or maybe an acidic ingredient may be needed to replicate a similar flavor that's removed. Can you make the change without sacrificing taste, aroma, and satisfaction? That's the question that you always have to ask. It's most important to look at the functions of those ingredients. When modifying ingredients, you have to think about what purpose each ingredient performs in the recipe. Is it there for appearance, flavor, or texture? What will happen to that product if less of that ingredient is used? Or what will happen if a new ingredient is substituted or included? You have to consider adding additional flavoring ingredients to enhance recipes, like roasted vegetables, chilies, reductions, etc. So, a lot of things to think about. Cooking techniques. Can you use a healthier cooking techniques, such as a dry sauté, and still get a quality product? Consider the use of various preparation methods that we discussed in Chapter 8. Last but not least, you want to evaluate the modified recipe to see whether it's acceptable. This step often leads to further modification and testing. Be prepared to test the recipe a number of times, and also be prepared for the fact that some modified recipes will never be acceptable. But each recipe modification becomes a learning experience that adds to your skill level and experience. So, in other words, it's really critical to get that for people to do taste testing to see if that modified product really is deserving of being made and being used. So evaluation is very important. And the thing to remember is, if it's not going to be tasting good, if it's not really something that's going to be acceptable, then maybe you keep the recipe as is. But if you're still concerned about the salt, the sugar, the fat, serve a smaller portion of that. And that's certainly something that, is very feasible. Of course, you don't want to go through the trouble of modifying current recipes. You can also select and test recipes from healthy cookbooks or websites, or maybe even create your own versions from scratch. When you develop new recipes, be sure to choose quality fresh ingredients, use appropriate cooking methods, and pay attention to developing flavor. As we know from many cuisines, it's really the fresh quality ingredients that make a difference. When you use quality ingredients, you don't have to put a lot into masking any flavors or enhancing flavors because you have them right there. There's no one way to accomplish your goals to modify a recipe. For the sake of your project, keep in mind that flavor is still the most important feature that you want to maintain. The outcome should be a similar product. Use your creativity. No matter what you choose to do, decide whether your outcome helps you achieve your goal. So when you're doing your project, you want to be sure that what you do to that recipe doesn't change it so drastically that it becomes another product. For instance, one student actually, instead of using phyllo dough, she changed it to puff pastry, which the end result was a totally different product, and the end result was actually higher in calories and fat because of the amount of fat in the puff pastry. So really think through what you plan to do, and then give it a go. Also consider garnishes, which are probably as important as the center of the plate item. They complement the dish and blend the flavors. So you always want to ask yourself if the chosen garnish complements the dish. Maybe an orange slice is the right color, but doesn't make sense for the food flavor. Modifying recipes to create more healthful alternatives can really be a challenge. If a certain food doesn't lend itself to modification and a substitute with a good nutritional profile is not an option, just serve that smaller portion of the real thing. Balance and indulgence with several healthier choices at the same meal. Make as many foods as you serve as healthful as you can, But keep in mind that even the most nutritious food will not be enjoyed unless it tastes delicious. You can see a theme here. Taste is everything. So again, it's not about making everything unpalatable. It's about flavor first. And if it's not going to be enjoyed, if it's modified, then use a smaller portion. And even if you have a very decadent item in a meal, you can offset it by having, more health conscious recipes or food items in that same meal. It can all work. And one thing that I always recommend is to always try to make progress, always try to seek enhancements as opposed to try to seek some perfection. So the remainder of this chapter really are just examples of recipe modifications. So I really want you to take time to review the chapter so you can get creative ideas for your project as well as for your personal cooking style. So we're going to zip through a lot of this, but I hope it gives you some, additional resources. The first recipe is the crab cake, and it can be either an appetizer or an entree. Think about it. And that makes a whole lot of sense if you can take an item that you have on the menu and use it two different ways. And it may be beneficial for the customer because you're taking a similar item like a crab cake, using it as an appetizer, and then maybe putting side dishes with it to call it an appetizer. And that really fits into the menu planning very well. So your traditional crab cake may consist of putting mayonnaise and maybe an egg, breadcrumbs, and then pan fried. But let's say you're wanting to step it up a notch and make it a little more balanced. You can use egg whites instead of the yolks. This particular recipe is using riced potatoes instead of mayonnaise, but you can use light mayonnaise or, use less of the amount of mayonnaise that the recipe calls for because it is necessary to have a binder. Instead of pan frying, you can, sauteing just very lightly in a pan, or maybe even finish it off in the oven. Instead of using tartar sauce as a side to go along with your crab cakes, you can have a very nice fresh fruit salsa. So there's a lot of things you can do with each of these, and that's why I think the book is real good for those people who haven't yet developed their style of cooking. And then, of course, this beautiful plate using quite a few garnishes and just a little niblet of crab and, a little frisee lettuce, all those kinds of things just, really add to the experience of eating that wonderful crab cake and possibly not even, miss all the mayonnaise and saturated fat you're getting from the original recipe. Another recipe would be like a roast chicken and shredded mozzarella tortelloni. Traditional wontons and dumplings are Asian in flavor profile and made with ground meat and sometimes chopped vegetables. Then they're deep fried or steamed, and they're served with a variety of cornstarch thickened soy sauce based dipping sauces. But for the makeover, you might just stuff them with chicken instead of the ground meat. Use some reduced fat mozzarella, maybe some fresh herbs and spices, and then maybe poach them or steam them and serve them with fresh tomato sauce or like a roasted red pepper sauce. But, in this particular kind of dish, you almost seem to be changing the flavor profile more from an Asian to more of like an Italian or Mediterranean, which is fine too, but that's just another way of, increasing or enhancing the nutritional value of the food. This end result is so much lower in fat, and then doing it with like in this picture, a nice tomato sauce, you're adding the vitamin A and also the beta carotene. And this almost looks like a balsamic vinaigrette reduction, which would be no extra added sodium. Whereas if you were doing the Asian profile, the soy sauce would be adding quite a bit of sodium. So there's a lot of ways to change it up that make it still delicious. You can make wontons with a variety of egg, spring, soy, rice paper wrappers, and wonton skins for maybe a lighter selection. Always think about what you can substitute. Mushrooms, chopped mushrooms work really, really good. And again, it's just, using your creativity. And then what do we do with different entrees? We're talking in this particular chapter about your traditional meatloaf, which is, very classic. But when you use a leaner ground beef, it cuts the fat, but sometimes makes a drier product. So you can add back in moisture by using grains, whole wheat breadcrumbs with stock, or even milk. And there's a lot of ways of reducing an ingredient, but you have to really understand what ingredient that plays in that recipe. There's a lot of ways to flavor and season a recipe, like using barbecue sauce in the inside, or maybe adding some, Asian flavorings like soy or, hoisin sauce. Again, it's just steps it up a notch and really kind of gives it a little different flavor profile. And then, of course, what you serve it with is also a consideration. I like to do personally a red wine mushroom sauce instead of a gravy. And that way, with my red wine, I'm adding resveratrol. I add usually some chopped tomatoes, some fresh mushrooms. So I call mine nutrition by addition because I'm adding nutritional value to the meatloaf. And when I use nice, like baby portobello mushrooms, it's giving you such a substantial mouthfeel and texture that you don't miss a big portion of meatloaf on your plate. So again, there's just a lot of different ways to achieve that end result of making it more balanced by taking away heavy calorie nutrients and adding more, more of the low calorie nutrients. In this picture, we're doing 3 vegetables, and the potato portion is really not very substantial. What about beef stew? What we're doing is starting with a flavorful marinated cut of meat, degreased stock, vegetable garnish. You can use corn or agar instead of traditional thickeners like a roux. You can add little to no salt. Instead of serving it with mashed potatoes, you can use a whipped cauliflower puree, or maybe even a mashed sweet potato puree. If you're doing a hamburger and you're making over a hamburger, you can certainly use ground chicken or ground turkey breast to possibly reduce the overall fat and saturated fat. You can use a leaner cut of beef. You can add some chopped mushrooms to the mix, which is a really popular thing that a lot of restaurants are doing these days. So there's ways of keeping it moist without really continuing to have a lot of saturated fat and cholesterol. A traditional quesadilla is typically made with flour tortillas, which are just shortening or lard and water and flour. Instead, you might substitute whole wheat tortillas, or maybe even just plain corn tortillas, or maybe some of the artesian blends, which have whole wheat and corn. Instead of, lots of meat, you can potentially put in a lot of sautéed vegetables or grilled vegetables that you have left over from another dish. There's a lot of ways of incorporating, a lot more density with vegetables. This is one of the easiest things to do, is substitute a lot of vegetables for some of the meat. You can still have the meat in there, but it also helps your revenue base because you're not, spending as much on the high expensive protein sources. So you can still have a tasty menu item without excessive fat and calories. You can do like a black bean salsa or a fruit salsa instead of sour cream and guacamole. Guacamole is certainly a good choice because of the avocado. But if you're really trying to cut back on the amount of fat, you might add some guacamole to your little salsa dish to go with your quesadilla, and that way you don't have to serve as many calories. So there's a lot of different things that you can do and a lot of different ways to make over the same items. How about lasagna? When you think about a traditional lasagna, lots and lots of different cheeses. Some people use meat inside this lasagna, some use a meat sauce. But it's better to substitute some vegetables, eggplant, zucchini, bell peppers, mushrooms. There's a lot of different things. Or you can use those ingredients like eggplant or zucchini in place of the pasta. So not only is it a gluten-free option, but it's also lowering your calories. Or you can maybe do, instead of a layered lasagna, you could do a rollatini where you roll it up. So using things like skim milk ricotta or feta cheese is going to give you less fat, less saturated fat. You're still going to get the calcium and the vitamin D from the cheese. So anytime you are working with a recipe, review the whole recipe and see what you might change. And you may not want to change everything because then your end result is so different from the original that you might have to give it a different name. You can see in this recipe that we've actually added a lot more vegetables to go with the dish. So instead of serving a huge big piece of lasagna, it's recommended that you serve